places like America. Today, we're going to continue our routine program from Eduversal webinar series. So first of all, let me give some information about Eduversal Indonesia. So this is the company that recruit teachers, and they provide this great teaching materials, webinars online. So in this pandemic, for the whole year, we've been receiving a lot of webinars from Eduversal Indonesia. And today, I'm going to be a moderator for seminar or webinar under the topic Key Language Teacher Competences in the 2020s. Today, we're going to have a very interesting webinar from our guest from England, Mr. Tom Kiddle. So this presentation will look at the professional competences teachers will need in the face-to-face or virtual or hybrid language classroom over the next decade. We'll consider the role of language change and language choices, content and language integration, digital technologies, and remote learning, teachers' assessments, principles, and practices, and also awareness of the language environment, learning environment. The invitation is to consider these competences in the light of the upheaval in teaching and learning, which have all experienced in the last 12 months, alongside on the undercurrent of developments in artificial intelligence applied to language education, and to examine how teachers may need to reframe and refocus their roles. So today we have our guest Tom Kiddle, Mr. Tom Kiddle, the director of NILE, Norwich Institute of Language Education, also vice chairman of Equals Board of Trustees, and a founding director of the Association for Quality Education and Training Online. He has been at NILE since 2011, after previously working in Portugal, the UK, Australia, Thailand, Chile, in language teaching, teacher training, and language assessment. His role in NILE involves strategic and organizational management and training and consultancy in range of areas, including the testing and assessment, learning technologies, materials development, and language teaching methodology. He has published in Applied Linguistics, Language Assessment Quarterly, and System Journals, and in 2019, 2 chapters in Routledge Handbooks of Language Teacher Education. So welcome, Mr. Tom Kiddle. I'd like to give the floor to you, but before, let me tell you, if you have any questions, so you can write in the chat box, so that at the end of the webinar, at the end of the presentation, we can ask directly to Mr. Tom Kiddle. Okay, now welcome. The floor is yours, Mr. Kiddle.
Okay, you may try to unmute yourself, sir.
That's great. Yes, thank you. I wasn't able to unmute myself there. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Genghis, and good morning, everybody, from the early morning here in Norwich. We're in the east of England, and it's a pleasure to be coming live to you in Indonesia and other places around the world. Thank you very much for the invitation to Eduversal. And I'm going to be talking, as Genghis has said, about a very personal approach to what I think the key competences are for language teachers in the coming decade. And what a start to the decade we've had. It's been upheaval in every sense of the word, and I think that teachers' responses to this have been fantastic in every context that I've seen and worked with teachers over the last year. In addition, the last 20 years, but the response and the adaptability and the innovation and the creativity from teachers has been fantastic. And it's been very impressive to me how teachers have really taken on that leadership role and taken on the responsibilities of adjusting in ways that have perhaps outshone the efforts of governments and institutions, and really pulled together with their learners at heart. This presentation is I have been working on for a number of years. Actually started thinking about some of these competencies before the pandemic hit us all, and obviously revised extensively in the light of what we've all been through in the last 12 months. But I would like to stress that it's a personal take on teacher competencies, and it's certainly not exhaustive, and it's certainly not exclusive. And it may be that at the end of the presentation you're thinking, well, what about this aspect of teacher responsibility? What about these teacher competencies? And it may be very much the case that you think there are other competencies which equally will be important to develop, and that's absolutely fine. And I'm not ruling out other competencies. This is just aspects of the teacher's role and the student's world that I think are going to be increasingly important as we take things forward and we move into our third decade of the 21st century and all that it may bring. Allow me to share with you the slide deck, and we'll just check that's working there. That looks good. So we're very much thinking about the world in terms of teacher development, teacher education, perhaps initial and pre-service teacher training, and aspects that we at NILE have been working with teachers on for all of our 25-year history, that have been thrown into sharp relief in terms of what is it that actually we need to be focusing on to deliver the best educational experience to our learners and to give them insights into how they can best develop their own learning. And obviously the teacher's role in the classroom is central in all of this. And I think I'd like to present a case in which the teacher remains a very central part of this. It's not my intention to make an argument that teachers' roles will be diminishing, or that developments in technology will sideline the teacher. Again, that's something that you'll have a personal response to and your own opinions of. But for me, I think one of the key things to remember is that we're always on a journey as teachers. And at different times in that journey, we feel different responses to it. We place ourselves differently emotionally and professionally in how we're coping with change and how we're dealing with our own development. And this image, I think, serves to underline that a little bit. And perhaps over the last 12 months, you felt yourself at different stages in your own professional development, and you may be able to place yourself right now. How do you feel about your own teaching and the way it's developing, the way you've progressed through your career, but particularly in the last 12 months? You may be like these characters on the left-hand side of the bridge and feeling rather frustrated and rather hindered and unable to do things in the way that you have previously, and feeling hampered by all the constraints that the world has placed on us in the last 12 months. You may have adapted to the emergency response phase of education in the times of COVID and have taken steps across that bridge, but are feeling which way to go now. Is it a planning for a return to face-to-face classrooms? Are there things that we want to hold with us that we've learned and understood and introduced our learners to over the last 12 months? Or maybe you're feeling an elation, a success. Maybe that's something you've done in. Sorry, I was placed on mute for a moment there. Maybe that's something you've done in terms of an individual success or series of successes. Maybe you feel you're on the right path. Important to think about where you are in your own journey at the moment. Is that something you've done with colleagues? Do you feel like this group on the right hand side of the bridge, you've had a successful journey over the last 12 months, or are you still unsure? And hopefully you're not feeling too much like these characters who've jumped off or are hanging on by their fingertips in the middle of the bridge. But in terms of our professional development, we need to see how we locate ourselves as teachers, how we feel about our own professional competencies, about our own skills, our abilities, our changing approaches to education, our responses to the new learner needs and perhaps new learning preferences that people have as they emerge into this world where online and hybrid and virtual and blended learning has come out of the bottle into the reality for so many teachers and students around the world. But before we think about the 2020s, let me take you back in time a little. I want you to go back in time with me over 100 years. Back in 1910, a French artist called Villemont did a series of pictures predicting what he thought the world would look like at the start of the 21st century. He did pictures about what he thought transport would look like, what he thought about home life would look like, what architecture would look like, what the working world would look like. And importantly for us, he did a picture representing his views of what education would look like at the start of the 21st century from his position over 100 years ago. What do you think he presented there? His view from 1910 looked a little bit like this. You can see in the top there, in the year 2000. So this is his prediction from his position in 1910. This is what education is going to look like in the start of the 21st century. And it's quite a dystopian, nightmarish vision. All the students individually wired in to this world of receiving information from the teacher reduced to mere content provider, feeding the information with no interaction directly with the students. This poor child on the right there who doesn't have access to the technology, unable to participate in the learning. So it is quite a nightmarish vision of the future. I think it kind of encapsulates some of the fears that we have about how technology might change our world of education, how it might change the role of the teacher, and how it might change the experiences of learners in the classroom. Of course, this is the negative side of what we see in teachers' fears of change and adaptability and the future, but it's worth holding on to. Do we hold those similar fears about what education is doing to teaching and learning today? And are those threats increasing, or are we able to relocate the teacher in the center of that learning experience rather than on the periphery? Well, in order to address this, we have to think about different aspects. And I think there are certain competencies which teachers will need to increase their awareness of, develop their understanding of, increase their competency in as we move forward into this decade. And the first one of those I'd like to present to you is the idea of teacher language awareness. Now, of course, as language teachers, whether you are a teacher of English or a teacher of another subject, or you teach a curriculum subject through English, there's a certain aspect of expected language awareness. But what is it that teachers can really grasp hold of to extend their development and to extend their understanding of the way language works? And I like this Confucius quote, because really teacher language awareness is not looking at the bells and whistles, the things that that are kind of these brand new aspects of language, but it's about the commonplace, the things, the levels on which language works that we need to become familiar with. Now, let's look even further back, 700 years ago, when we look at the language as it developed at the start of the written word and the printed word, and English becoming more and more accessible in printed form, English looked very different from it does today. This is from Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And as you look at this Middle English, you might see some words that you think, okay, yes, this hasn't changed very much. I could read this word. I could have a fairly good understanding of what this word is. But there are other words in there you think, wow, that's completely disappeared from our language. Those words make no sense anymore. Those phrases, those structures make no sense to me. And there are others that you might think somewhere in the middle. Okay, that's got a different spelling and perhaps a different pronunciation, but I could have a good guess at how this worked. If we look at a kind of a translation of that, we can see that the structure is fairly similar, and some of those words that you picked out have stayed exactly the same. Some of those guesses you may have had will be fairly accurate in there. words like the husbands and the numbers and the goods and the bads. But we can see clearly that there's a lot of change come into the way we present the language and the way we express our meaning through structure and vocabulary. As we move further into the 16th century, well, we see more standardization, more regularization of the spellings. Here's a Shakespeare sonnet, which gives us an insight into the way language looked in the 16th century. We've got some of those words we might think of as kind of old-fashioned English now, but still in that modern English world, the these and the thous and the haths. And then there's those contractions of dimmed and untrimmed and ost and grossed. But we can generally see that language change is moving towards more standardization, towards more shared awareness of spelling and structure and grammar and rhythm in the 16th century. Fast forward to the late 20th century, before our current decade started, and in some contexts it looks like things have gone backwards again. Look at this extract from a contemporary novel of the late 20th century, Train Spotting. The introduction or the reintroduction of varieties of English into the world Englishes, and the use of dialect and local vocabulary and local expressions being part of our English. So we need to be aware of how language is changing over time and what aspects of change are driving that adaptation of the use of language and acceptance of different varieties of English. And nowadays, our learners will be exposed to English in so many varieties. We're no longer the gatekeepers of the world of English. It was true when I started teaching, and perhaps for many of you, that 20, 30 years ago, the greatest exposure that a learner in a non-English speaking country would have to the language would be through the teacher and through the coursebook and the course materials. That's no longer true. And so language change is all around us. And that can be the kind of diachronic change over time, but it can also be synchronic changes about how language changes from influences. But we as teachers need to be aware that language is about choice, and language expressions are about the choice that the speaker wants to make and the learner wants to interpret. So if you look at these two sentences, ways that we look at the language that's around us today are very much about the choices that we make about how we want to be received, how we want to be perceived by our listener or by our reader. You can see in that first part, which we might call traditional reported speech, he told me that he had already been there and I responded that I hadn't seen him. Very much that traditional reported speech, moving a tense back, using deixis to talk about the locations, moving tenses and clauses back. And the second one, and he's like, I've been there, innit? And so I go, well, I didn't see you there. Looks almost like a different language, and it's certainly a different presentation of ourselves, but it's still English, it's still very much acceptable in a certain context, and it's still reporting the speech of someone else. It's still presenting us. But what it's important here is it shows the level of choice that a user of the language has between how they want to be perceived by their listener, their reader, how they want to locate themselves within that experience, whether they want to adopt a formal or a very informal approach, whether they want to come across as being a part of a particular speech community. And we need to be aware that these language instances are about choice on the part of the speaker, not about correctness in terms of grammar rules or something we might find as the only way to express an idea, to express meaning. And teachers need to dig under the surface of what those different forms of language mean, because it's very important to empower learners to see the difference and to allow them to make those choices. Similarly, if we look at grammar, we see rules in course books and methodology books and reference books which say, here's a rule for conditionals, you use this conditional in this sense, you use this conditional when this is the situation you're in. But if you look at those two sentences, we can see that actually the choice I'm making between whether I use a first conditional sentence, as in the first sentence there, or a second conditional sentence, is not about grammatical correctness. They're both grammatically correct. It's about how I want you to see my vision of the future. Do I think that this is a reality that's going to happen and that I'm going to respond to personally? Or do I want to distance myself from that? Do I want to make it less likely in your perception of how I interpret this situation, and I want to distance myself from the responsibility for it? And that's a language choice on the part of the speaker or the writer, and it has implications for the listener, for the reader. And if learners don't have that capacity and teachers don't understand those differences, it disempowers the learners to be able to respond to that. And this is really important because we're moving into a world where we're going to be pressured to, I think, adopt or adapt to artificial intelligences and the way machines can use language, the machines can process language, and the machines can process our language. This article from a recent British newspaper, an entire article written by a computer, drawing on expressions which seem to fit the context and the meaning. AI being able to generate an entire piece of text that's grammatically correct. But as language users, we have the responsibility to determine the choices we make, our idiolect, our personal expression of ourselves through language, and our sociolect, the way we locate ourselves within the particular social group or particular domain of use. And that's what gives us identity as language users. And artificial intelligence is never going to be able to replace that identity that we have as language users, that we construct through the choices we make about language. And teachers need to understand that. Teachers need to understand that language is about identity, language is about choice, language is not about learning rules. And the more we can empower our learners to make those choices themselves, or to understand those choices that have been made by other meanings, the more we differentiate ourselves from this generic form of correct language that artificial intelligence may be able to produce. So language awareness is a critical teacher competence. It's critical that teachers understand that language allows us to show others how we perceive ourselves and our distance from the events that we're talking about, how we perceive the distance between ourselves and other people, whether those are the people we're talking to or whether those are the people we're talking about. Language choice allows us to express our emotions through language, through the choices we make, that people understand where we're coming from and understand how we feel about a particular topic. It allows us to express how much responsibility we feel for the events we're talking about, how much centrality we have in terms of the acts we can take to change that. Language choice tells our listener, tells our reader how much we can expect to understand between each other. And most importantly, on a pragmatic sense, our language choices allows our learners and our listeners and our readers to read between the lines, to understand our intentions, the aims of the choices we've made. So all of these aspects of language awareness, understanding how language works beneath the surface, I think are going to become even more important in a technologically enhanced real world, outside world, but also world of education, because it's that construction of identity through language that I don't believe artificial intelligence will be able to do for a very long time. So I've presented to you my first argument, that language awareness is going to be a key teacher competence, and we need to understand not just how to analyze language and how to parse it on a verb, noun, preposition, subject, object level, but also to understand the choices that language use gives us to express all of the things that make us human and differentiate ourselves from that artificial world of intelligence. You may be familiar with the Widdowson quote from back in the 1980s, that there's a huge difference between a phrase expressed, "I'm in the bath," and all the implications of that use of language, versus "I'm in the bath," and all the implications of that choice of language. It's going to be a very long time before artificial intelligence can capture that type of identity and meaning construction through the same set of words. So language awareness, absolutely critical in terms of how teachers center themselves in the learner's experience and how teachers can help learners face the language choices and the language changes which are coming in this decade of the 21st century. The second argument I'd like to make is that assessment is going to be even more central in the way we look at education, for good and for bad. And therefore, teacher assessment literacy, teachers understanding the principles of assessment, are going to be crucial. So let's start with a test. Very simple test. It's a multiple choice test. And the test is a single question with 4 possible answers. Which tree is the biggest? Which tree is the biggest? Well, you may be very confident and have gone for an answer straight away and think, well, I know, of course, that A is the biggest. Look, it occupies the most space in the physical world. It's perhaps got the most leaves and the most branches. Or you may have said, no, it's quite clear that B is the biggest because it goes the highest. If we think about language proficiency or educational proficiency, it's the highest up on the scale. It's the tallest. It reaches the highest point on our frameworks, our levels. Or you may have said, no, of course, C quite clearly has the biggest girth, the circumference, covers the most ground and is grounded most fully. And that's what we want our learners to have, is that breadth of knowledge rather than just a single spire of proficiency. Or you may have said, no, look, D is quite clearly the biggest because it goes below the ground, below the surface. We can see the extent of the roots, the extent of the underlying knowledge that learners have, if you'll allow me to pursue the analogy, that it goes deep into the ground. And that's what we want our learners to have. So I'd rather the biggest, the most in terms of knowledge and competencies was D. And of course, in a way, you'd all be right and you'd all be wrong. The best answer to this question for me is, well, it's a rubbish question. It depends. If you haven't asked, if you haven't explained, if you haven't clarified what you mean by biggest, well, then we can never successfully answer this question because it's only going to be about personal interpretation of what biggest means in this context. And if we're thinking about language and educational proficiency, well, then we might say, if we knew that biggest meant highest on the level of proficiency or most items known or breadth of knowledge or depth of knowledge, then we could answer that question more effectively. But of course, language and learning isn't as simple as this. We can't just say, okay, it's static, we'll count the leaves on the tree or measure the height of the tree and say this is the right answer. Language is a little bit more like a swarm of bees. Sometimes it's very compact and in the hive and easy to measure. Sometimes it's spread out and it's constantly morphing and changing. And how does our own language development or subject knowledge development stay static over time? It doesn't. Where on earth do we cut and measure a swarm of bees? How on earth can we be confident that we've got the right picture of the learners at the right time in terms of what their understanding is and making that meaningful for others? And it's even more complicated than that for assessment, because we have to bear in mind the affective side as well. And we know, as these 2 quotes show, the first one, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. Of course, it's very tempting in the assessment world to say, look, if I can put a number to it, if I can measure it with a multiple choice question with a right and wrong answer, then I can count it and I can give a report that's reliable and fair. But just because I can count it and measure it doesn't necessarily mean it's important for my learner's development, doesn't necessarily mean it's the only thing that's important in what learning means as a whole system. And not everything that counts that is really important in education can possibly be measured. We all know that motivation and attitude towards learning are hugely important in successful learning. How on earth do you measure motivation? Can we say this learner's a 3 and this learner's a 4 and this learner's a 5 in any meaningful way? Of course we can't. We don't measure motivation in number terms. So not everything that's really important can be counted. And we have to keep that in mind as teachers and assessors of progress and proficiency and performance. And also we have another job as educationalists, which makes it even more difficult than rocket science, because we're trying to describe very complex phenomena, things that happen in different parts of the brain interacting with each other to produce knowledge and awareness and use of language particularly. And we're trying to do that. We're trying to describe that phenomena, that learning process, or that knowledge use description in a very small number of words, because we need to explain it to students, we need to explain it to parents, we need to explain it to other stakeholders, and we have to use layman's terms. We have to use quite simple expressions that anybody can understand to describe something very complex when we don't really know the full theory of what happens in the brain when people learn and store and retrieve information, and most particularly how they store and retrieve and use language. We don't know fully which parts of the brain interact when we're learning a new language, and how does that interact with our first language, and where do we store vocabulary, and how do we retrieve that. And so we've got a real challenge as assessors to say, I'm going to put these measurements on and they're going to be meaningful for the people I'm working with. But we have to take on this challenge as teachers, because everything that we do, I believe, is centered around assessment. I'm not talking about testing there. I'm talking about assessment in terms of understanding where our learners are, where they need to go, and how I can help them. And as teachers, we assess from the moment we meet our students, whether we're meeting them in a physical classroom, whether we're meeting them in an online setting. Everything they do is part of our assessment of whether I move on to the next page of the course book, or whether I need to review and revise and revisit these things. And so all of this is about teachers assessing how their learners are progressing. And we have this idea of validity as well, possibly the most used cartoon in the world of language assessment and assessment generally. And forgive me if you've seen it many times before, but this idea of fairness. What is it that we can do as teachers to make sure our assessments and the ways we measure and report on learners are fair for them? And how are we sure that this is not unfairly disadvantaging particular categories of people or particular individuals? I think this cartoon is much misunderstood, actually, because people see it as that a fair exam has to be that everybody can pass. And this seems to be the surface meaning of the cartoon, that if it's an exam that not everybody can pass, then it's not fair as an exam. And of course, that's not the case. Good tests, good exams, good assessment allow those who have the skills to pass, and those who don't have the skills not to get a passing mark. And that's fine. If I'm measuring the language proficiency of an air traffic controller, I don't want everybody to pass that exam. I only want the ones who have the skills that are crucial for that job to pass. So actually, fairness means making sure that people aren't disadvantaged for aspects which are outside the test content. It's fine for people to get an answer wrong if they don't have those skills, but we need to be clear and confident that what we're measuring is actually what we want to measure, and the decisions we're making based on our assessment are actually related to the learning content rather than educational background or gender or some other advantage that's not related to the learning content. So we need to keep that in mind as well as assessors. We also need to remember that there are different strengths individual teachers and institutions have in order to assess. When we measure productive skills in language, that's kind of performance assessment, that's speaking and writing, then all of the responsibility for quality really lies on the rater, the person who's making those expert judgments. Some people are very good at this. Some people are very good at interpreting rating criteria or rubrics in American English and making decisions about learners based on matching them with descriptions. For others, it's much harder to do that fairly and to do that confidently and to do that consistently. So we have a weight of responsibility on that side in one context, but in other ways we measure, when we want to measure in language, listening or reading or underlying competencies of grammar and vocabulary, actually the whole weight of quality lies on the ability to generate good questions and to generate fair options if it's a multiple choice or a matching task, to generate these questions that hold the quality rather than the scoring procedures. And so teachers and institutions need to understand there are different skills involved here, and that not everybody is great at other things. So cooperation and awareness of different strengths is really important in assessment generally, and language assessment particularly. And we also need to keep in mind that our tests, the way we assess, the way we measure, have an impact on our learners. It's not really why we got into testing. We didn't get into testing so that, there's a slip, perhaps Freudian. We didn't get into teaching so that we could be test preparation engineers. Standardized tests often isolate the teacher and remove the teacher from the centralized nature of education. And of course, there are advantages of a standardized measurement approach in fairness terms and also perhaps in delivery terms, but we need teachers to be aware of how they fit into the assessment world and to be empowered with an understanding of assessment, so they can say, this is a good way to measure my students, this is a fair way, or I need to introduce some other aspects if I have the possibility to be part of that assessment. And part of that for me is understanding learning-oriented assessment. If you haven't come across this term of learning-oriented assessment, it's really worth looking into. The idea that we don't need to be constrained in our teaching context by the kind of standardized tests and exams that learners might have to face. We can understand what's going on under the surface of assessment and look at, well, the certification purpose has to be standard. It has to be this particular format for the ease of marking, but we as teachers can understand how to enable learners to develop the skills that underlie that measurement, and that we're not constrained into doing past papers or doing test practice. We're actually developing skills which are useful for learning as part of a broader picture of assessment. And that involves, can we repurpose test and assessment and exam tasks as part of our learning activities? Can we get students themselves to understand how the questions work, how the tasks work, so they can be self-evaluating, self-reflecting and supporting themselves and others? And can we give meaningful feedback? Can we position ourselves regularly through the learning experience so that our feedback is actually feed forward and helps learners get better the next time they're measured, whether that's through an informal teacher assessment or whether that's through a much more formal externally imposed assessment. So all of these have an impact on the way learners and teachers perceive assessment, and I think teachers need to be empowered to do this. And we need to be clear that this is part of our 21st century world. All of these skills that we think of as crucial in the world today, all of these lists that we get about the 10 most important skills for the next decade of the 21st century, the things that we need learners to have when they emerge from educational systems: creativity, collaboration, being able to work in teams, being able to use resources, being able to access information, being able to use that information, being able to work together, being able to be innovative. When we use these in a traditional test, all of these skills are called cheating. Learners working together on an assessment? Ridiculous. How would we ever know who's got the right answer and who hasn't? How could we possibly have collaboration in assessment? But we need to be aware that if we're going to say these things are important in the real world, the outside world, then we need to position them in the world of the classroom as well. And we need to have ways of measuring and supporting and feeding back on precisely these kind of life skills that support learning of the content or learning of the educational skills as well. A big challenge, I know, but it's one that I think we're only going to overcome in teachers' response to the threat perhaps of artificial intelligence and automated marking and increasingly standardized testing, is for teachers to understand more about the assessment process and to center themselves in that and take responsibility for it. So I've claimed that language awareness is going to be crucial, assessment literacy is going to be crucial. The third argument I'd like to make is that we need to become increasingly aware of the learning and teaching environment. I've become really interested in the work of this man, Professor Stephen Heppell, and the work he's done around learning environments. And those two images you can see on the left of the screen are the original prototype for this device he's come up with and the current iteration of it. This is called the Learnometer. And the Learnometer is a device that sits in classrooms and measures aspects which previously in earlier generations of education were perhaps invisible and intangible, and are crucially important because they have a real impact on how learning takes place. And we as teachers need to be aware of these invisible aspects and to be aware of how important they are. And what this device does, this Learnometer, it measures the light levels in a classroom. And the light levels that learners have while they're learning are crucial because science, research, empirical evidence shows that lighting really impacts on the way you learn, and particularly the way you're measured. If we go back to the last section, good lighting is crucial for good education. Temperature is crucial in the learning environment. When we get above 21 degrees centigrade, learning performance goes down. Again, empirically measured, it's incontrovertible that if we're too cold or too hot, it's very difficult to learn. And I know this has impact on institutions and the way we set up our classrooms as well, but understanding that is crucial. Sound volume, the rhythms, the external sound patterns outside are very distracting, and how our concentration is affected by what goes on around the classroom and what goes on outside the classroom. Really important to be aware of this impact on education. One of the most scary things, the impact of too much CO2 in a learning environment, too much carbon dioxide, is quite terrifying when you look at the research, and Stephen Heppel's site presents this very clearly, that as we get too much concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in the learning environment, it's really difficult for learners to learn, to focus, to concentrate. And it's very easy for that to happen because in a classroom, in a physical classroom, we're having lots of closed spaces where the oxygen's being taken in, the CO2 is being emitted. And so for long periods, perhaps for half a day, the air is becoming less and less conducive to learning. We need to be aware of this. Stephen Heppel goes as far as to say, if you want your child to do well in school, tell them to do two things: sit near a window and open it. And that will have the biggest impact in their education than many other factors, which is a little bit glib, but it's quite profound to think that these kind of factors can have such an importance on learners' ability to learn. And of course, this is a physical setting, but it's equally true of when we're asking learners to learn online. Let's think about the learning environments they're in. Are they able to be hydrated, to be drinking water while they're learning? Are we able to give them breaks from the screens to reduce eye strain? Can we follow the 20-20-20 rule that suggests that when we're learning in an online environment, looking at a screen, as you all are now, every 20 minutes, we should look away from the screen to a distance of 20 feet, 6 or 7 meters, for at least 20 seconds. So I'm going to invite you to do what I say, not just listen to what I say. And now for 20 seconds, just focus your attention away from the screen. Just focus your eyes on a point distant from the screen for just 20 seconds to give yourself that break from eye strain that your learning environment is dedicated to at the moment. So all of these things that Stephen Heppel's talking about in the physical classroom environment are also important in the learning environment. We've got to get learners to have enough oxygen in the room where they're working, to control the temperature as much as they can, to be hydrated with water, to stretch and to move their bodies when they're sitting in one position for a long time, to reduce eye strain from looking at a screen. All of these things impact on learning, and the more teachers know about them, the more teachers can support healthy learning environments, whether we're physically in control of it because it's our classroom space as a teacher, or whether we're in fact trying to control 20, 30, 40 different learning spaces because our learners are learning remotely. So awareness of the learning environment, I think, is going to be an increasingly important competence of a teacher in this decade of the 21st century. The elephant in the room, I guess, digital literacy is my fourth claim. We're going to need to position ourselves as teachers with control and understanding of what the impact of digital devices and digital platforms are in our learning. Back when I started teaching my first classroom, maybe this will be familiar to you, a good old cassette recorder. a overhead projector. If you worked in a very posh school, you may have had one of these. I don't know if anybody knows what this is. Not a beamer, not a projector, an electronic pencil sharpener, the height of educational technology back in the mid-90s. I was never lucky enough to have one of these, but looked on enviously. Nowadays, in the last year, we've just seen the accumulation of all sorts of products, platforms, devices, promised new futures, virtual reality, augmented reality, learning platforms, asynchronous online learning, synchronous online learning, Zoom rooms, all of these things. It's kind of overwhelming for a teacher. How do we position ourselves to be literate enough to take control of this, to feel empowered with these digital solutions, digital opportunities, rather than overwhelmed by them? I think we have to take a principled approach. We have to remember that it's the why that's really important in the choices we make pedagogically, not the what. And to remember that there are things that we know are ways to frame our educational approaches. This is one. Bloom's taxonomy gives us these levels of higher order thinking skills and lower order thinking skills. And there are things that we do in the classroom that focus our learners on basic lower order skills like remembering, understanding, up to higher order things like creating and evaluating and synthesizing. And some of these verbs here can help us to think, how do these relate to classroom tasks? And when we've got the why are we doing this activity? Why are we using this technique? Why are we using this approach? Because we want learners to explain something or to discuss something or to analyze something. Then we can think about the what. And there's a quite scary what's called the Pedagogy Wheel here, which actually takes Bloom's taxonomy and presents 188 different applications that you might be able to use as a digital teacher to address precisely these aspects of Bloom's taxonomy. You can see here I've just centered in on one segment of this Pedagogy Wheel that looks at the verbs in create and looks at all these apps that potentially you could use to do this in the classroom. Obviously, suggesting that a teacher should be literate in 180, 200, even a dozen different apps is crazy. Nobody should feel that pressure. Nobody should feel that that's a good thing to be as a teacher. But we do need to think about the pedagogy that's emerging from this. We need to feel comfortable with a few key tools. We need to feel that we have this as our resource, as part of our teacher's satchel that we take into a classroom, whether that's an online learning situation or a physical situation where we're integrating technology. We need to make choices based on these are the tools that I know will help my learners to do the task, to do the activity, to progress in the way that I'm interested in. And that will possibly, for some teachers, be 3 or 4 different tools, 3 or 4 different applications or platforms that they're comfortable with. For others, it may be more and it may be expanding, or you may be the kind of teacher who likes to put this in the hands of the learners and allow them to explore and be kind of autonomous in their choice of the resources that they use for their digital literacy. One thing that's clear is that best practices are still emerging. We've been thrown into this world in many contexts over the last 12 months, and we've had more exposure to digital-based online learning than we'd ever have thought possible 12, 13 months ago. But that doesn't mean the pedagogy has kept up with that pace of immersion into online learning. So we need to be aware that that pedagogy will continue to emerge, and there'll be different ways of doing things. And I think that teachers have been very much at the forefront of this, from the emergency response period, moving through to a period of innovation and creativity. And over the coming years, that will become a consolidation. What is it that we want to hold on to about the platforms we've used, the approaches we've taken, the online affordances of education that we don't want to lose when we return to face-to-face classrooms? What is it that we'll keep? And what are the best practices that will support our educational approach that we'd like to hang on to from being thrown in at the deep end with online learning? And part of that, I think, will be decisions about the importance, the relevance of what's termed hybrid teaching, or hybrid flexible, high flex teaching, or co-modality teaching, where we're faced with a situation that some of the students are physically present in a bricks and mortar classroom. Other students are in the same learning live environment, but remotely connecting through a webinar platform like this one, or in some other way connecting, and how do teachers adapt to that pressure to manage two distinct groups of learners? How do we stop them being two distinct groups? How do we allow the pedagogy to emerge without destroying the educational aims as we're moving? And so I think that teachers are going to be forced to take a stand as an individual and say, this is what I have in my resources, this is what I'm comfortable with, but also to continue to adapt, continue to be open-minded, continue to look at the ideas that are coming through. And a lot of that is going to be supported by your peers, working with others, because the idea of a teacher trainer coming in and saying, I know the best way to do hybrid flexible teaching, is kind of crazy, because teachers on the ground have more experience of doing this online learning than many of the kind of generation of teacher trainers who learnt their craft in the face-to-face classroom. So it has to be more collaborative. It has to be more bottom-up in how we support teachers' digital literacy, learning from each other, in-service training, sharing ideas, talking about what works well and what doesn't work well in the staff room, or in personal learning networks if you don't have a staff room and colleagues to work with. So these things are going to be increasingly important in this last decade. I've talked about 4 things then, and I'm going to go on to the 5th, conscious of time and your own sustainability in an online learning environment. And the 5th one I'd like to argue is that we're going to see an increased integration between language learning and content learning. Back in 2007, my colleague at NILE, who's one of our CLIL specialists, Content and Language Integrated Learning, went as far as to say, if you want to teach language, teach something else. Increasingly, content is the valid vehicle for language teaching, not just because we've got a task that's related around a reading on a subject, but actually the learning of other subjects through English is going to become more of a feature of bilingual approaches to education around the world, I feel, and that teacher understanding of the integration between how we learn a language and how we learn content areas is going to be crucial. It's going to be part of our skill set, because increasingly there's going to be contexts in which these are blended and merged. And that may be teaching language through content, teaching language with content, more project-based learning, more autonomous learning, more collaborative learning to emphasize these 21st century life skills, the increasing role in educational systems of CLIL approaches and English medium instruction approaches, and the mediation of information, the way in which we work with other skills beyond language skills to share comprehension and understanding with others. So teachers are going to need to understand, what is it about the procedural demands? What is it about the linguistic demands of content? What is it about the structure of the way we're learning and the way we're supporting language use and the way we're supporting subject knowledge that allows us to integrate them? And I think that for a long time, we've kind of seen English teaching as on the left hand of this spectrum, this idea of there's a general English or maybe an English for specific purposes track where the teacher is only responsible for language development and the content is just there to kind of give meaning to the words rather than for any content development. And over on the right-hand side, we've got this English medium instruction approach where actually the teacher's delivering in English, but is only responsible for the content knowledge and the subject knowledge development. And really the language has to be formed or absorbed by the learners on their own. And then in the middle, we have these CLIL approaches where teachers have a combined responsibility for both language development in their students and the subject development. And increasingly, there's going to be blends of these, I think, in educational institutions and educational settings around the world, as the access to education in other language other than the local language becomes more and more important in a globalized online world. Mediation, I think, crucial. I just wanted to introduce this concept because it's been such a feature of the 2018 companion volume to the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So much attention given to mediation, using language for the purposes of helping others understand. And all these scales developed in the 2018 companion volume. I think mediation and the way in which we help our learners become useful users of language rather than just learners of language rules is going to be a real key aspect of teachers' competence in this coming decade. So I've presented to you these teacher competences, these aspects of teachers' skills that I think are going to be important. And I'm going to wrap this up by asking you to consider a final test task. This is a standard, what could we call this? This is a banked gap fill task. And I'm going to ask you to place 3 words from the bottom into the correct places in the text. I'll give you just a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, so a little test task, you can self-mark. Did you get these correct answers? It is advisable that the teacher should understand and even to be able to criticize the general principles upon which the whole educational system is formed and administered. He or she is not like a private soldier in an army expected merely to obey, or like a cog in a wheel expected merely to respond to and transmit external energy. He or she must be an intelligent medium of action. And I hope you'd agree with much of what's expressed there. The reason that it's presented as he rather than she, as so many teachers are female, is that it's similarly from over 100 years ago. And I started off the session looking back 100 years. This is from John Dewey back in 1895. But the principles here are very much ones I'm espousing today in this presentation, that teacher competences in the 2020s are about this teacher empowerment, about this ability for a teacher to understand the principles of language, in language teaching, of assessment, of the environment that we learn in, of the digital world that's a part of our lives, and about the way content and language interact. Because we have to be able to respond and adapt to those, but also to be empowered to be the vehicles of change and to be the vehicles of resistance if necessary, where we don't feel that things are pedagogically suitable or the best for our learners. And that's really what a teacher's role is. We know that change is coming. I love this quote, which really emphasizes the way innovation drives change. The Stone Age didn't end because people ran out of stones. We'll have things we could go back to, but do we want to do that? Or do we want to seize opportunities? Do we want to take new opportunities? Do we want to take these, the change that's happened over the last 12 months and the changes that are coming over the next decade, and be taking ourselves into a new age of education with teachers at the heart of that, teachers taking responsibility for that change and feeling empowered to be part of it rather than it being something that's done to them. So on your teacher development journey, you may have positioned yourself somewhere on that bridge. And I'd like you to look at this character in the red now, just to reflect back on that. I think this character is the most interesting on the bridge. What do you think that character in the red is saying to everybody else on that journey? What might he or she be indicating and saying and shouting to this group? For me, this character is saying, hey, everybody, guess what? Over there, there's another bridge. And I think that's true of our professional development journey. Wherever we are in our immediate circumstances, we need to be aware that there'll be another bridge to cross, and that we'll need to be empowered with new abilities and new understandings to do that. But it is part of our lives as teachers. It's one of the best things about our lives as teachers, the ability to constantly adapt and change. I hope this has been useful for you to share my own thoughts about where teachers' competences need to go. And as I said at the start, you may well have additional competences that you feel are going to be crucial as well in the coming year, or you may feel that some of mine are flawed and not so central to your context or your life as a teacher. But hopefully it's been food for thought. I've come as a representative of NILE, as the director of NILE. I do want to flag up just one thing that's part of our offering at NILE, which is our free members area. We have a membership resource that if you go to our website, which is nile-elt.com, you'll be able to sign up for membership. And in the members area, there's loads of resources for teachers. There are podcasts and webinars, and there's a full glossary of all the terms that we use in the world of language teaching, and further reading on all those terms. There are activity cards for great activities to do inside your teaching classroom. If you're a trainer, lots of training activities. There's a CEFR tool that helps you really understand and isolate the parts of the Common European Framework which are maybe useful for your lesson planning or your course planning. There's a text analyzer which helps you process how vocabulary is being used in single text. Loads of different resources they're always being added to. So please do sign up for membership, and hopefully we'll be able to see you on some of our more formal professional development offerings in the future as well. So I'm really grateful to everybody at Eduversal for the opportunity to speak to you, and I'll hand back over to Cengiz perhaps for some questions from you guys.
Thank you. So we have some questions here. Let me start with first question came from Mr. Agung Rianto. He wonders, how can we survive to cope with the rapid growth of exposure in language teaching as an EFL teacher? That's question number one.
Yeah, okay, if I'm understanding the question correctly, the idea is that our learners are exposed to all sorts of different language and different types of language and different mediums of language, and how do we cope as a teacher to know which ones we should expose them to? I think it's a really important question. I think we need to acknowledge that language they meet in the world of the internet, in the world outside the classroom, is not necessarily going to be the same as the language that's presented through traditional materials. What we need to do is give people the basis to make good critical decisions about the nature of the language they're being exposed to, and to make decisions about how useful this language is for their own learning, for their own language use. I think we are seeing developments in critical literacy, but we need to support those as teachers. We need learners to be able to make decisions about the usefulness of what they're exposed to, and most importantly, how can we put this, the contextual appropriacy of the language they're exposed to. They need to know that the way language is used in a YouTube clip from some teenagers is not necessarily the same language that's appropriate for another context. So it's developing that awareness of learners to see language choices that are being made by the different producers of all the billions of words that are around us on the internet, and understand that those language choices are for a purpose, as we looked at in an early slide. And if we can encourage learners to see that those are different language choices, and therefore they as language learners and language users can make similar choices, I think that's the best we can do. We certainly can't be mediators of all the language they're going to be exposed to.
Thanks. So I guess this will be the answer. There's another question from Miss Aulia about the aspect language awareness. Given the fact that English is global, and hence the understanding of various cultural understanding might be necessary to understand the underlying meaning behind the text. For example, unlike English lecturer in the university, English teacher in K-12 focuses on teaching morphology, syntax, and semantics, and less likely pragmatics. How can English teacher in K-12 teach the understanding of cutionary, locutionary, and illocutionary to student?
Well, that's a question that's a presentation in itself. Yeah, I think there are different learner needs, and the thing is about in higher education that those learner needs are more focused. We know that people have made decisions about where they are going, and that there are particular types of language use that are more appropriate for particular faculty areas than others, and particular texts that they'll be more interested in. Our problem as K-12 teachers is that the focus hasn't narrowed down. All different aspects of language use are possibly useful for learners' future selves, future needs. And therefore, we do tend to be a bit reductive and reduce that to, well, how can I give them the building blocks of the language? How can I give them the grammatical structures and the I guess the understanding of the core structures of English and useful vocabulary to support that, because I have to cover so much potential future use. I think that what we need to do is to look at how we can make the language use tasks in a classroom in K-12 meaningful as the vehicle to dealing with those illocutionary aspects. What is it that allows learners to do things with their language rather than just to tick boxes with their language? You know, this is nothing new. This is 40 years of communicative language teaching. How do we make the tasks meaningful and have a reason for completing them beyond the language development aspects? And so I think that is the key for K-12. And I know that's a motivational challenge because learners may not see the immediate importance of English or doing that particular communicative task. But I think that's the only way in which we can make the language use in the classroom meaningful beyond you're doing this because you need to learn these building blocks and you'll be able to develop them in the future. It's probably a question that deserves a presentation on its own to answer it, but I hope that's a half decent stab at an answer from my perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Next, we have two more questions. So about the assessment literacy, do you think it's very crucial for teachers to give students time to reflect after an assessment is given?
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm a strong believer in reflective practice for learners as well as teachers. I think that reflection without support or without guidance is a pretty difficult ask of learners. You know, they've put up their effort into doing the test. They get their marks back and then are told to reflect on it. Well, reflect on what? I think that needs to be guided, that needs to be structured. I'd certainly argue that the feedback we give on a test is equally, if not more important than the test results themselves. The test, or any test, any good assessment is a hugely rich source of information for the teacher in terms of what to do next, where to go back to focus on, what learners are comfortable with and can be challenged and pushed in other directions. And so as long as that reflection is guided and learners have the resources and the understanding of how to reflect on their own performance, whether that's individual or as a class, then certainly it's a crucial part of assessment, particularly when we think about assessment in formative terms. That feedback from the teacher, feedback from learners to each other is crucial. I think it's also really important to have a space for learners to ask the teacher questions about the test, about the content, about the answers. I think it's a lovely phrase that I think is really true, that as teachers, we learn more about students' needs from the questions they ask than the questions they answer. So giving space for learners to ask questions about their learning and about the assessment is really valuable information for a teacher as well.
Thank you very much. While you're answering, I'm still getting some questions in the chat box. So there we have 3 more questions. Do you think it's very crucial for language learners to practice visible thinking skills? From Ludilin.
Yeah, there are two things that have come up when I've talked about similar topics before. One was raised by your second questioner, this idea of intercultural awareness and cultural understanding as it relates to language learning. And the other is related to this aspect of kind of visible thinking and making learning visible. I think they're both really important teacher competencies and should, and I hope will, be important in the coming decade. They're not personal areas of expertise or strengths of mine, so I haven't included them in a presentation which is about things that I feel empowered about myself. But I think certainly for other people, intercultural competence and making learning visible are really strong teacher skills, and the more in which we can get learners to see their learning as a tangible and an aspect they have some control over is fantastic for learning pedagogy. I would support it completely.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to read the last two questions at once. Is it appropriate during the pandemic, teacher must give an assignment to students in a Google Classroom? And the last one, what is the best learning evidence to show the learner they really engage the process of learning during this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, for me, what I hope will emerge when we get to a way out of this pandemic is that there will be some things about using online platforms which we don't want to get rid of. And part of that for me will be the importance of asynchronous learning. Asynchronous, I mean learning done in the learner's own time, using platforms like Google Classroom or Edmodo or Moodle or any of the other platforms that allow learners to work collaboratively, upload content, work on their learning at a pace that suits them. And I think that's really important. It's easy to forget that a classroom environment forces everybody more or less to work at the same pace. And working asynchronously allows learners time for deeper processing, for more reflective processing, for more resource-based thinking. They can bring in other resources to help that. And I think that those asynchronous platforms are going to be, I hope, a feature of educational settings in the future, rather than just seen as we did that during the pandemic, but we don't need to anymore. So yes, I think using Google Classroom is a very valid method of getting learners to interact with learning, and hopefully with each other, and certainly with the teacher. And I would see that education needs that to be part of its approach, not just you're in the same space at the same time and that's when your learning takes place. What was the other question? Sorry.
The other one, what is the best learning evidence to show the learner they really engage the process of learning during this pandemic?
Yeah, okay, absolutely. Engagement's one of those aspects of education which is almost easier to see in its absence than it's in its presence. We know what disengagement looks like. We know when learners aren't present or aren't visible or aren't involved, but it's kind of hard to measure different types of real engagement. And one thing that's always been a challenge, certainly for online learning, and certainly in this pandemic response, has been, is peripheral involvement sufficient? Is reading but not contributing? Is being part of a session but not actively responding still engagement? I think these are things that will emerge as best practices. I think it's incumbent on the teacher, it's a teacher responsibility to have techniques up his or her sleeve to continually measure and expect that engagement, expect those responses, whether that's through responses in a text box, whether that's through indications with your camera that you're part and you're following, short little activities that demonstrate an easy response, but demonstrate that you're aware of what the task is and aware of your own response to that. I think it's saying it's more difficult in online learning suggests it's easy in the physical classroom. When you have class of 30, 40, 50 children or learners, it's not easy to measure engagement in the physical classroom either. But I think, yes, it's certainly a responsibility of teachers. Evidence for me would be the kind of activities that we can do regularly and having engagement expectations on the side of the teacher and transmitting those to learners, rather than a kind of a get away with it culture where actually just because you've logged on is sufficient to show you're in this class.
I guess that's the end for question and answer session. And it's already 3:17, the time allocated for this webinar. And
yes.
I express my gratitude, Mr. Tom Kedal, for your seminar, which I believe was very valuable for us all here as teacher of English or maybe other subjects as well. I hope today we can go home with heads full of new knowledge and new information. I hope here all the participants got something new from your seminar. And here we also have the certificate. But before getting the certificate, to get the certificate, please submit the survey. I will share it in the chat box. There will be, okay, here. So you can check in the chat box. There is the link for the survey. Only open within 1 hour after the webinar. Yeah. So to get the certificate, I guess you need to fill the survey. Thanks for joining this seminar. Thanks, Tom Kiddle, for your sharing your knowledge. I hope we'll see some other day, some other time, and with all these participants as well in next webinars by Eduversal Indonesia. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Nice to work with you all, and good luck with all your teaching.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tom.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Mr.
Bye-bye.
Tom. And
Bye.
bye-bye. See you. Bye.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Kiddo and
Thank you, Mr.
Eduversal. See you.
Thank you.
Stay
Bye-bye,
safe,
everybody.
everyone.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Tursun.